About describe the process and a little bit about my painting in the early stages and kind of work through that evolution over the 60s, 70s, and 80s. In the early 60s, when I really got involved with painting, as I mentioned before, I started out more as an abstract expressionist and more expressive, but very quickly got interested in color, and that caused me to start painting in very non-textural surfaces with a lot of consideration about color relationships. And that almost immediately led to simple forms on the canvas, just areas of color. And then as I was beginning to paint that way, I saw as forms, say a rectangle on the canvas, I saw that it was interesting to me to break off an edge and create a different condition at one edge than the others. And when I did that, I noticed that something was happening between the band of color that I broke off and the solid, the object that it was broken from. There was something happening between the two on the field of color that separated them. So not too long, I was breaking down these forms, rectangular forms on the canvas, just into bands of color that were within a rectangle, but so they formed that same shape, but they were bands of colors with little spaces between them. And I began to notice that the spaces between were being influenced by the colors on either side, and were changing colors even though I wasn't painting them differently. But in the eye, there was a liveliness and a kind of energy in there. So, and these paintings were painted in a conventional way. I prepared the canvas and painted. In the very beginning, I was using oils, and then I changed to acrylic quite early on. And so I prepared it with a ground and painted on that in a fairly conventional way, very carefully, these color relationships. And so, and I was noticing what was in between the bands of colors. It was as important to me as the relationships of the colors in the bands. Also, I had pretty much committed myself to my investigation of color by eliminating dark-light contrast, except in very maybe obvious ways. I mean, maybe the area, outside area around the field I was working in might be some dark-light contrast to it, but the central issues in the painting were defined by only hue differences and saturation differences. And this sort of forced me to look at the color very carefully and make the paintings work on the basis of color, not because they were, say, bands that were darker and lighter. And that sort of discipline taught me a lot about color, see color, and also I developed ways of thinking about color without actually putting it down. In other words, abstractly with diagrams and so on. Then I started to visualize a sort of sphere of color in which I could navigate with in my mind and begin to set up these color progressions. And I was working with color progressions, very, very minute increments of color, but were just discernible, going from one region of color to another, but they were very, very small in terms of the overall dimensions of color. But when you played them against each other, they read very well, very subtly, but they read clearly. So that work went on for a while. I was doing these paintings in Capitola, living up in Depot Hill. Had a studio behind the house, and my children were very young. My youngest child was born there at that time. And so it was a full life. And we moved from there over to King Street in Santa Cruz, and I painted in one of the rooms of the house. And I went from the Aura series, which I've been talking about, to what I called first parabolic. It was the first painting, and then hyperbolic, and a couple others that were extensions of this Aura concept. But in these paintings, I began to actually modulate the ground, the paint, the field on which these bands of color were resting was changed also. So now it's getting change in there, but so gradual that you really couldn't see it. It just sort of flowed from one color to another in a very subtle way. When you look at the paintings, you don't see the increments. It's almost as if you made a wash that changed slightly from one color to another. And this work was done between the bands of color, and then the color bands were in themselves progressive, and they would change. And from one band to the next band, we could change color, so that the interaction between the bands of color and the ground in which they were placed, which was changing too, created a much more complex and interesting color field. And there were a resultant pattern in it, which I saw as where the minimum contrast was in the painting, which would form this curve, this parabolic curve, or in the case of hyperbolic, there were two parabolic curves playing against each other. So that led in that direction, and the hyperbolic, that painting was chosen out of thousands of paintings in the U.S. to go to the Corcoran Biennial in Washington, D.C. I think that was 1968, but I'm not sure. To go on the tour, but the collector who bought it wouldn't release it. So that sort of was the culmination of that thought, that moving in that direction. And about that time, I got interested I was thinking about in the 20th century how in painting and or the parallels in painting and in physics, writing, literature, that the whole notion of a fixed point of view had been exploded. So in an Einsteinian universe, it was a relative universe. In painting, Picasso and others broke up images so that you saw in a painting an image that was a compilation of many different views simultaneously. In writing, James Joyce wrote Ulysses, which is changes point of view, and so this relativistic universe came about the awareness of it became about in an early part of the 1900s, and all these manifestations were happening in the leading edges of creative thought. This was one of the classic manifestations or expressions of this was Rashomon, the film, Japanese film, which showed one event from different points of view. And so there were 4 or 5 different realities for this one event that occurred in the movie. And that kind of fascinated me, and my mind was working a lot with that, and led to a notion of all-overness or no focus in a painting. Just the whole surface is, any place in it is important as another. And so I launched more into just paying attention to the field of color as a form in itself. And as I stated before, I started to think of as color as form, and moved into a series of paintings that I called Oriental Card Game, by number 1, 2, 3, and so on. The name comes from the fact that I did use some chance operations to determine how the color was distributed on the canvas. And what I was led to was to create a grid, a 13 by 13 grid. So that was 169 almost squares. They were slightly rectangular. And they had a space between them, this band or this I've been working with on the other paintings previously now became a grid. And I then would, in different ways, choose, I would mix 13 colors very closely in a sequence, from one continuous sequence from one end to the other, and say from a blue to an orange, except that the range was in the grays. But if you played the blue end of it against the orange end of it, it really read as orange and blue, even though if you looked at it within the whole spectrum of the color wheel, it would look like it was almost gray, the full range. So once those colors were mixed, which I spent quite a bit of time mixing them to get them so the increments were, I felt that they were correct, then I would distribute them on the canvas in different ways with chance operations. And that's where the card game part of it came, because I used cards to do this. And then the Oriental part of it is the way I laid them out on the canvas was from the top to bottom, from the right to left, like the Oriental writing is done.
You said you use cards for chance operations.
Them and pick one out, and then do it again, so that I was randomly choosing the colors. So, and then as I worked with that idea, sometimes I would develop a quadrants. I would make, for instance, the progression of the color would go down from the top to the bottom in 13 and maybe across, and that would create these 4 quadrants. And then those quadrants would take the colors that were on the 2 sides of it and randomly have them distributed in that quadrant, and the same for another quadrant, and so on. So I started to play with variations like that. Some control, some determination, some chance operations. And, and somewhere in that series, I felt the impulse to get away from having paint on a surface. It just felt like I wanted to have the paint really integrated, more part of the canvas, more sinking into it. So I started to stain in that series and painting directly on the canvas rather than with no ground. And for me, for some reason, it was satisfying to let that watery paint soak into the canvas. I liked that sense of it. I liked how that they integrated, they interlocked, and it wasn't something just on the surface. It was physically interpenetrating, and that had I liked that part of it too. So I started to think that I wanted to go more in that direction. Somehow, whatever I was doing would be directly on canvas without preparing it, and with the ground. So the canvases were stretched still, and I moved out of this very controlled grid and went back, in a sense, to the bands of color. But now, rather than putting them in and seeing them as like a form, like shaping into a rectangle, I saw them as the subject themselves, just band of color. Just let that be the what I was working with. And so there were a few paintings which I call my horizontals, which were maybe 10 feet long, and they were stained, and there was just three, well, sometimes more, but usually three bands of color. And these three bands of color didn't go all the way across, so they had an end, and they related to each other, and they related to the ground, which was stained too, but not very darkly. And so there was a warm ground, let's say, and a cool band of color or something, so it kind of vibrated. And also these bands of color were shaped. I mean, they weren't just straight necessarily. And for instance, the first one of those paintings I did, I believe, or one early one, was called Concave. And that painting was three bands of color that had a bowl form. It was concave. And the space, for me, as the artist, and what I saw, the space that was held above these, or by these bands, was very important. And the bands were set lower in the painting. And the painting wasn't meant to be high on a wall, so that when you looked at it, your eye level was more level with this space of the raw or slightly stained canvas above these bands. That to me was as important as anything in a painting. That series went on, and a few other things were going on, but I was always a little bit bothered by the importance of the end of the bands of color. And I was still working with color in subtle ways, but of course there was a higher contrast now because there was a lighter background, and the colors had fairly strong saturation. But they were also changing from one end to the other. So I could start painting at one end and then mix the color as I went along while it was wet, so I could make a transition to the other end, say from a yellow-orange to a red-orange or something like that. So, and do it in a continuous way that, you might see an airbrushing or something, but I was doing it with paint. But it came to the ends, and the ends I didn't quite know what to do with. I wasn't too happy with them because they were too important in the painting. They were sort of seems to me taking away from these other parts of my visual interest, and in color, and now the spaces that were forming in the by these bands of color. So I resolved it with a very obvious way, but it wasn't obvious until I got there, was I just connect the ends of the bands together and form a circle. And so I did that, and about the time we moved up to Meter Street in western Santa Cruz, and initially I had a studio there. First studio that was on upper side of Meter Street and in an old dairy barn of some kind. And then we moved over to a house that was on it way out at the end, and I had the garage as a studio. But when I was up in this dairy barn, I thought about this painting, this series I was going to do, this circle series, and I conceived of it as an 8-foot square. And so I started building this stretcher, and I got it built, first one built, and then I realized that I couldn't get it out the door. And so the size I ended up with was 7 feet because I could get it out the door. And that was how that size, 7 by 7 square, came about. Horizontals. And there are 3 bands of color were in large circles that were almost out to the edge and close together. And so 3 bands. So there was a great open center space in these paintings. And those bands of color not only interacted with the ground, but they interacted with each other, and they changed as they went around, so that they were continuous in their changes, so that a blue-green might change to a blue-violet, and then come back as it got back to its starting point as a blue-green, and it might play against a different, maybe a complementary color that was changing in itself. So it's a rather simple concept, but when I took it up to that scale, it had a pretty strong presence. And also things were happening visually with the center. The center, depending on the color relationship of the bands to the ground, would look look three-dimensional, kind of bow out like a slightly domed, a dome shape. So there were things going on there that were I discovered that are pretty interesting. And so I continued that series over on the other studio out in Meter Street. And immediately upon completing it, the Vandervoort Gallery came down from San Francisco, and they were an international gallery and doing well at the time. And they had an opening in almost a month later, maybe 6 weeks later, for a show. And so he was excited about the paintings and took them, and we had a solo show in San Francisco with those paintings. That was about 1969, I think. I think I was a lot of other things were going on. We made some moves and left Santa Cruz for a while and came back maybe a year later. Pomona was commuting down there for a couple years, and moved to the 13th Avenue house, where I established a studio, very small studio over the garage, and painted my largest paintings there. About the early 70s, I felt like going further into letting go of the conventional structures of paintings, and I still wanted to stain, but now I wanted to throw away the stretcher bar and work directly on canvas, just canvas and paint. And here I was in this very, very small space. I mean, it wasn't more than 10 or 11 feet square, and it wasn't real high. Maybe 9 feet in the center, slope roof, and a little tiny deck outside, and that was it. And so I wanted to do bigger works, and so I built a frame in there on which I could stretch across from one side to the other like clothesline wire, and then shape the canvas over this, in and out, fold it back and forth, and having a higher and lower end. And then through mixing the paint, I would mix it and then pour it on this canvas. And so all the canvas wasn't getting paint on it. There would be gaps because it was folded back in and came out again, and the paint flowed. And this was kind of pretty exciting at the time. And I realized what I was doing was using gravity as a paintbrush, basically, and that I was still mixing color ahead of time and thinking about color, but now the color also sort of spontaneously mixed itself, as it went down and went over the other color. There was a third color brought into existence. And so I would think about this and try to anticipate sort of the character of the painting. Of course, I couldn't determine exactly how it was going to look, but the general character and I was pretty good at anticipating the color mixes. And so I spent a lot of time mixing the colors so that I would get certain results color-wise, and also it was important to me to get the right viscosities so that the paint would flow correctly on the on the canvas and not be too stiff or too watery, and then had to make decisions of whether to pour wet paint on wet paint or wait till paint dried. So it all was a kind of a dance. And sometimes I wanted to get the paint on very quickly. So it required a sort of Zen-like concentration of doing it without interference, just being 100% with that dance for a rather short time, but being 100% there with it. So I did a lot of preparation, and then the actual physical part of pouring paint and so on was very short in duration. And what I was getting was, when I unfolded them, was evidence of that gravity was helping me, and that there was also evidence of these topographies that were being formed. And the result was, when you stretched it out, was there was evidence of time, because it took there was duration, evidence of duration in the paintings, because they would change from top to bottom. They start at the top, very smooth, full, fall through space, maybe splatter, fall again, more splatter, and maybe once again, and then maybe pool off the bottom, or maybe stop and be, a lot of drips that would be showing at the bottom. And this was pretty exciting, because it brought this other dimension in, a time dimension, into the painting that I hadn't even thought about before. And also, there's a lot of, the chance operation part of it. There was this chancy, that you pouring this paint. And so that was interesting. And so I worked with that and started shaping the paintings in different ways. And I shaped one that was, I think it was called Cascade, or it was number 5. And it just was shaped back and forth so that when you look at it, there's this progressive diminution of the amount of paint that's going onto the canvas as it goes down, and it's a number of these this painted progression moves down, and so it gets less dense and less dense, and this sort of gets very minimal at the bottom. And I did that in parallel, so it's almost like a cascade, you see, in a water and stream. So these paintings were getting longer, higher, maybe 7, 8, and then they were up to 10, 12 feet, and even a little bit higher in some of them. They were all meant, that whole series is meant to be stretched when it's displayed. So I just kept moving on with that and found that, I could shape the canvases to the left, to the right, and I started to think of it as topography, valleys and swales and the way water moves, and was working with that, and my color ideas too. So there was high contrast now. There was definitely dark and light here, and all the dimensions of painting, which I felt was important. I didn't want to stay forever in that. That series went on for a while in the early 70s, and recently one of those, I think number 44, it was given by a donor to Occidental College down south for their collection. They have one of the circle paintings I mentioned, and they have that one, the following series, and they have one of the next major series I developed during the 80s, the Santa Cruz series. By the middle 70s, I had some major changes in my life, and I wasn't painting. I did leave Santa Cruz for a while and came back and moved into my First Avenue place after in 1977. It was a small apartment, 400 square feet, with a very good light and doors open to the east, and a little balcony and block from the beach. And so I turned that into a studio, and didn't quite know what I was going to get into there. I didn't have anything in mind, and after a while I started to, I was looking at the windows a lot, and I decided to, make some window studies, what I saw out my windows, different windows there. And so I started to sketch that, and then I started to paint those on paper, and we have a number of examples of those. And not that I was trying to be realistic particularly, but I would start there as a starting place, and then very quickly move into a more abstraction. But it was a stimulus to organize my visual mind and myself as an artist. And I was also doing some other kinds of drawing, life drawing from the figure, and a few other things. But that was sort of central in the development of the next series. So I was painting those, and one day I just decided that I'd go on up to a larger size. And I think you asked me a question about why the size of my paintings. And there was something about working on a painting and not being that conscious of the edge of the painting. And so I developed this sense of being comfortable with paintings in which I could just reach across my